The morning was a gray blanket, heavy and damp, pressing down on the skeleton of the city. It wasn't grandeur that remained, but a sharp, intimate wreckage. The teeth of broken buildings bit into the sky. The air was a permanent stain of powdered brick, the acrid ghost of last week's fires, and underneath it all, the cloying, sickly sweetness of something rotting in the cellars. This was no longer a place for people. It was a landscape of aftermath, and into it moved three ghosts who still remembered being boys. Franz worked with a rhythm that was almost prayerful. Each brick he lifted from the blocked doorway of what was once a bakery, each careful placement into a growing pile, was a verse in a silent liturgy of defiance. He believed, with a fervor that was terrifying in its purity, in the final victory, in the sacred soil, in the words on the torn posters showing steel-jawed heroes. He wore his father's old wool scarf, now frayed and full of holes, like a knight's favor. His world still had order, a cause, a front line somewhere out there that could be held. Klaus moved differently. He didn't just see rubble, he saw geometry and threat. His eyes, pale and constantly scanning, mapped escape routes, noted which walls were load-bearing shells ready to collapse, which alleys offered sightlines for a machine gunner. While Franz built, Klaus calculated. The numbers in his head were cold and simple. Food stores, probable artillery trajectories, the life expectancy of an infantryman in a city fight. He watched Franz's devout labor with a hollow feeling in his stomach. Not contempt, but the dread of a man who sees a friend walking cheerfully towards a cliff edge. Hans was a raw nerve in a too-big coat. Every distant thump of artillery, a sound as constant as a sick heartbeat, made his shoulders tense. He flinched at the sudden skitter of a rat in the debris, at the groan of shifting timber. His job was to carry the splintered wooden bucket of dirty water they'd hauled from a shell crater. He held it with both hands, focusing all his being on not spilling a drop, as if this one task, performed perfectly, could keep the chaos at bay. He followed Franz's lead, clung to Klaus's pragmatic silence, a shadow seeking other shadows for protection. Their fragile, self-assigned mission, clearing a path to a basement some called an aid post, was obliterated not by an explosion, but by a sound of grim, shambling order. A clatter of mismatched boots on shattered cobblestone, a rustle of ill-fitting uniforms. They turned as one. The Volkssturm column was a procession of the forgotten and the not yet grown. Old men with faces like dried clay, their postures bent by a different war, wearing imperial uniforms bleached by time. Boys. So many boys. Some younger than Hans, drowning in greatcoats, their helmets sliding over their eyes. They carried an arsenal of despair, ancient rifles with straight bolts, a few light machine guns that belonged in a museum, and in their hands, over their shoulders, the stark, stupidly simple tubes of the Panzerfaust. The weapons looked like brutal toys, their oversized warheads a grotesque parody of a child's drawing of a rocket. A whistle pierced the air, sharp and final. A pinched-face officer with the bearing of a defeated schoolmaster shouted commands, his voice cracking. All males, from 15 to 60, were to assemble in the main square. The order was not an invitation. It was a current, and the three friends were swept into its icy flow. They were pushed, jostled, absorbed into the gray mass. There was no roll call, no speeches about honor. There was only distribution. A pair of hard-eyed men moved down the ragged line, shoving weapons into hands. Franz felt the cold, rough steel of a Panzerfaust barrel placed in his grip. His fingers closed around it instinctively. He held it upright, a standard to rally to, his other hand coming up to steady it in a posture he'd seen in newsreels. A fierce, terrible pride straightened his spine. He was a soldier now. Klaus received his with the caution of a biologist handed a venomous snake. He immediately tilted it, examining the crude flip-up sight, running a thumb over the trigger mechanism. His mind was no longer calculating abstract survival odds, but the chemical burn radius of the propellant, the flight time of the shaped charge. The weight of the thing was all wrong. It felt less like a weapon and more like his own coffin, handed to him in advance. Hans's turn came. The man thrust the tube forward. Hans's hands, still damp from the bucket, fumbled. The heavy weapon slipped, the warhead scraping against the cobblestones with a gut-wrenching screech. A nearby sergeant turned, his face a mask of fury. Hans scrambled, tears of pure panic blurring his vision, finally clutching the monstrous thing to his chest as if trying to hide it. He was not a soldier. He was a boy holding a piece of collective death he did not understand. Then the instructor came. Not the officer, but a man from the real war. A veteran with a scar that pulled his mouth into a permanent grimace, and eyes that had seen every way a man could break. He held a Panzerfaust aloft. His voice was flat, stripped of all emotion, a machine reciting a manual for suicide. "Effective range, 30 meters, he barked. "The length of this square. Closer is better. Backblast will kill anything behind you. Clear your escape route first. Aim for the side, the tracks, the rear engine deck. The front is stone. It will laugh at you. You do not stand and fight. You ambush. You shoot from a cellar window, from a hole in the wall. Then you run. You run faster than you have ever run in your life. You are not knights. You are rats. And your job is to bite the tiger once in the heel and disappear." As he spoke, the distant artillery rumble, a constant background noise, changed. It grew closer, deeper, more personal. A new sound layered underneath it. A heavier, more rhythmic crump, 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 walking its way toward the district. The ground itself seemed to vibrate in response. A fine mist of dust rained from a fractured facade above the square. And then the instructor did something unexpected. He finished his lecture, lowered his training weapon, and his dead eyes swept over the sea of old men and children clutching their rocket launchers. For a fraction of a second, the mask slipped. What looked out was not anger, not pride, but a bottomless, weary shame. It was the look of a man watching a ritual sacrifice he was forced to conduct. He didn't say another word. He simply turned his back on them and walked away, melting into the ruins, leaving them alone with their weapons and the approaching storm. Franz tightened his grip on the Panzerfaust, the metal biting into his palm. The veteran's shame was a language he refused to understand. He saw only the weapon, the symbol. Klaus watched the man disappear, and the calculation in his mind finalized. The equation was 0. He was holding 0. Hans stared at the tube in his arms, his breathing a rapid, shallow pant. The weapon was no longer just steel and explosive. It was a contract, and he had just signed it, with his terrified, fumbling hands. The new, closer artillery thunder was no longer just a sound. It was a promise of monsters, moving through the arteries of the broken city, coming their way. The stone boys were no longer just hiding in the ruins. They had been handed a single, terrible tooth and ordered to become part of the rubble that would try and fail to stop them. Silence did not return to the square after the veteran left. It was replaced by a deeper, more invasive quiet. The shuffling of feet stopped. The coughs and muttered complaints died in throats. The air itself seemed to thicken, holding its breath. The three boys stood frozen in the dispersing crowd, their new reality a cold, inert weight in their hands. The distant artillery had ceased its sporadic rumbling. This new silence was worse. It was the silence of a trap being set, of a great beast pausing to sniff the wind. Then it began. It started not as a sound, but as a vibration, a faint, almost subliminal tremor through the soles of their boots. The fine grit on the cobblestones danced in minute, concentric circles. A dangling piece of broken gutter somewhere above clinked softly against a brick. Hans was the first to feel it, a physical wave of nausea passing up from the ground into his stomach. He looked down, confused, thinking it was his own trembling. Klaus felt it next. His analytical mind, searching for a data point, locked onto it. He dropped to one knee, not in prayer, but in measurement. He placed his palm flat on the cold, damp stone. The vibration was clearer now, a low-frequency hum that traveled up his bones. It was regular, rhythmic, not the chaotic shudder of an explosion, but the deliberate, crushing cadence of immense moving weight. Franz heard it first, a distant, grinding groan, like mountains of scrap iron being dragged across a concrete plain. It was layered with a higher-pitched metallic shriek, the protest of steel tracks winding onto broken pavement. Then came the deep, guttural cough of heavy diesel engines, not one, but multiple, their roars overlapping into a single, hostile symphony of power. The sounds were still blocks away, but they carried a physical presence, pushing against the ruins, making the hollow shells of buildings feel even more fragile. The square dissolved into a silent, desperate panic. The old men's stoic facades cracked, eyes darted, searching for exits that didn't exist. A boy no older than 12 dropped his Panzerfaust with a clatter and turned to run, only to be yanked back by a snarling sergeant. The order was hissed, not shouted. To your positions! Cellars! Rubble piles! Now! Their little trio was broken apart by the tide of bodies. Franz was shoved towards a shattered storefront, whose display window was a spider web of cracks. Klaus found himself propelled into a dark, reeking doorway that led to a cellar stair. Hans, paralyzed, was almost carried along by the flow until Klaus's hand shot out, grabbing his coat collar and dragging him into the dank gloom. Klaus's hiding place was the basement of a haberdashery. The air was thick with the smell of mildew, burnt wool, and chemical dyes from spilled bottles. Dim light filtered through a street-level window, now sandbagged to a narrow slit. Franz was across the street, in the skeleton of a calf, his position slightly forward. Hans huddled next to Klaus, his breath coming in short, wet gasps that echoed in the small space. They couldn't see each other, but they were bound by the shared, thickening dread that pulsed through the walls. The sounds grew. They were no longer just noises. They were dimensions of the approaching threat. The crunch, crunch, crunch of masonry being pulverized under treads gave the monsters a weight measurable in tons. The sporadic, deafening boom of a massive caliber gun firing somewhere ahead, not at them, but at some stubborn strong point, defined their destructive power. Each report was a physical blow to the chest, followed by the apocalyptic roar of a building collapsing several streets over. Dust, new and ancient, trickled from their ceiling with every shot. Then, a new element. The sharp, angry crack of small arms fire. Mosin Nagants, PPSH submachine guns firing in bursts. The Soviet infantry. They were the teeth around the jaws. They scuttled and flanked, their movements a staccato counterpoint to the tank's dirge. Shouts, in a foreign, guttural language, filtered through the ruins, chillingly close. Klaus pressed his eye to the narrow gap in the sandbags. His world shrank to a slice of the hell outside, a view of the cratered street, the opposite facade where Franz was hiding. He saw movement, not a tank, but shadows flitting from doorway to doorway, low and fast, green-gray uniforms. Then, from a side alley, a muzzle flash. A German MG-42, hidden somewhere up the street, unleashed its terrifying, ripping cloth burst. The Soviet shadows dove for cover. One didn't make it. His body jerked and spun before falling into the rubble. It was a clean, clinical kill at 70 meters, and it changed everything. The rhythm of the giants altered instantly. The grinding treads halted. The deep engine rumble dropped to an idle, a predator's purr. An absolute, breath-holding silence fell for 3 heartbeats. Then, the world ended. The massive 122mm gun on the lead IS-2, still unseen around the corner, fired. The flash lit up the entire street for a split second, bleaching the color from the ruins. The sound was not just loud, it was a totality of noise that swallowed all other senses. The air pressure punched through the sand-bagged slit, knocking Klaus back and filling the basement with dust. He didn't hear the impact. He felt it through the earth. The building where the MG-42 had been firing simply ceased to exist. Where there was a 4-story corner tenement, there was now a collapsing plume of orange fire, swirling dust, and an avalanche of brick. The shockwave rolled down the street, blowing out the remaining panes in the calf. Front, showering Franz's position with glass and debris. This was not warfare. This was demolition. They weren't fighting soldiers. They were insects in the path of a bulldozer that could fire back. Hans was curled into a ball, hands clamped over his ears, weeping silently. Klaus, ears ringing, dragged himself back to the slit. His calculations were gone, erased by the sheer, overwhelming scale of the violence. His mind held only one image, the veteran's face. You are rats. Your job is to bite the tiger once, in the heel, and disappear. Across the street, Franz's vision swam. His ears bled from the pressure. His noble pose was gone, buried under plaster dust. He blinked, trying to clear his eyes, his hand still locked around the Panzerfaust. The symbol had just been replaced by the reality. The prayer in his heart turned into a single repeating word. How? The diesel rumble deepened again. The grinding of treads resumed. They were moving, not fast, with a terrible leisurely inevitability. The first metallic edge of a track appeared at the far end of the street, chewing into the cobblestones. Then the massive sloped glacis plate of the IS-2's hull nosed into view, a moving slab of armored steel the color of mud and dried blood. It was wider than the street. Its long, brutal gun barrel, still smoking from the last shot, swept slowly from side to side like a terrible antenna. It was not just a machine. It was a force of nature made of cast steel. It was the coming end of their world, turning the corner and rolling straight towards them. The IS-2 filled the street. Its reality was not just visual, but visceral. The heat from its engine bled through the cold air in visible, shimmering waves, carrying the stench of diesel, hot metal, and something oily and burnt. The sound of its idling engine was a bass tremor that vibrated in their teeth. Every rotation of its massive, interleaved road wheels was a distinct, grinding clank, clank, clank that measured the shrinking distance between life and obliteration. Klaus, from his cellar slit, saw the monster in fragmented glimpses. The sheer scale of the turret, a cast-iron fortress. The deep gouges and bright raw scars on its armor where earlier, futile shots had glanced off. A red star, faded but defiant, painted on its side. This was not the sleek, predatory tiger of propaganda newsreels. This was a brutish, utilitarian juggernaut, built not for finesse, but for annihilation. The long gun barrel, as thick as a man's thigh, pointed directly down the street, a blind cyclops searching for its next target. Across the street, Franz's world had shrunk to the circle of his iron sight. He had wedged himself into a corner of the shattered calf. The Panzerfaust braced against his shoulder, the crude aiming prongs aligned on the approaching behemoth. The veteran's words were a jumbled scream in his head, fighting with his own instincts. 30 meters. The side. Not the front. But the tank was facing him head-on. Its frontal armor was an impenetrable cliff. He watched the barrel sweep past his position, pause for a heart-stopping second on the building next to his, then continue. He held his breath. He was waiting for an order, for a sign, for the tank to turn and present its flank. He was waiting for a fair fight that would never come. Hans, in the cellar's gloom, was beyond strategy. He was in a primal state, his body screaming for flight, trapped in a stone coffin. Each metallic clank was a hammer blow on the lid. He clawed at the dirt floor as if he could burrow deeper, away from the sound. Then, movement. Not from the IS-2, but behind it. A smaller, lower shape darted from an alley, scurrying behind the Titan's bulk like a remora behind a shark. A Soviet, T-34-85. It was quicker, more agile, its angular silhouette a stark contrast to the IS's brutish curves. It peeled off from the heavy tank's flank, pushing forward up a parallel side street, its own gun traversing, covering an angle the IS-2 could not. This was the tactic. The heavy monster as the anvil, the mobile T-34 as the hammer, flushing out defenders. The T-34's path took it diagonally across the top of the street, exposing its side and rear to Franz's position for a fleeting 3-second window. It was the wrong tank, the lesser monster, but it was a target. In Franz's frozen mind, a switch flipped. The sheer oppressive presence of the IS-2 had paralyzed him. This smaller, faster machine was something he could comprehend, a target he could engage. The fear coagulated into a desperate, misguided action. This was his chance to be a soldier, to strike a blow. He ignored every rule. The range was over 40 meters. The angle was poor. He was aiming at a moving target. He squeezed the trigger. The world behind him ceased to exist in a hurricane of fire and noise. The Panzerfaust's backblast, confined by the calf, its broken walls, was a cataclysm of its own. A jet of superheated flame and scorching gases filled the space behind him, igniting tattered curtains, blistering paint, and filling the air with a choking, chemical smoke. The rocket projectile itself streaked across the street, a hissing, orange-tailed comet. It missed. It missed by a wide, humiliating margin. The shaped charge screamed past the T-34's turret and detonated harmlessly against the brick wall of a bombed-out pharmacy, in a spectacular but useless blossom of fire and shattered masonry. The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. The T-34's turret snapped towards the source of the shot with robotic speed. But more critically, the dormant giant, the IS-2, was now alerted. Its massive turret began to rotate, not with haste, but with a dreadful hydraulic inevitability. The long 122mm barrel began to depress, searching for the insignificant little hole that had dared to spit fire at its companion. Franz was blinded by smoke, deafened by the backblast, his face scorched. He had failed. The symbolism of his weapon, his faith, his moment of heroism, had evaporated into acrid failure. He dropped the now useless tube, the metal scorching his hands. He didn't see the turret turning towards him. He was lost in the smothering cloud of his own mistake. Klaus saw it all. He saw Franz's foolish, desperate shot. He saw the miss. He saw the T-34's gunner zeroing in. He saw the IS-2's barrel becoming the single most important line in the geometry of the street, a line that now terminated at Franz's hiding place. Calculation returned, ice-cold and absolute. Franz had seconds, maybe less. Klaus acted without thought. He shoved the weeping Hans aside, grabbed his own Panzerfaust, and lunged up the cellar steps. He didn't go into the street. He moved perpendicular to the threat. He burst through a shattered back door of the haberdashery, into a tiny, rubble-choked courtyard, then kicked open a rotten wooden gate leading to the parallel side street. The very street the T-34 had entered. He emerged not behind the IS-2, but almost alongside the T-34. The smaller tank was 20 meters away, its side a perfect, broadsheet target, its attention completely focused on Franz's position across the main street. The tank's commander was half out of his hatch, pointing and yelling towards the calf. There was no ceremony, no braced stance. Klaus simply raised the weapon from a crouch behind a pile of broken furniture, didn't even use the sight, and pointed it at the center of the tank's flank. He pulled the trigger. The kick was immense. The roar was personal. The shaped charge flew true. The impact was not a giant Hollywood explosion. It was a brutal, localized act of physics. A jet of superheated molten metal pierced the T-34's armor like a white-hot fist through paper. Inside, hell ignited. Fuel, ammunition. The secondary explosion was internal, then external. Hatches blew off. A fireball roared from the engine deck and the turret ring. The track snapped with a sound like a giant cable breaking. The tank lurched, died, and became a roaring pyre. Klaus didn't see the crew try to escape. He was already moving, the spent tube discarded, his ears ringing. He had followed the veteran's instructions to the letter. Ambush, flank, minimal distance. He had bitten the tiger in the heel, but he had bitten the smaller tiger. As he scrambled back towards the courtyard, a sound cut through the roaring fire of the T-34. It was the distinct, heavy clunk of the IS-2's main gun, finding its target and firing. The world dissolved into light and fury. The 120mm high-explosive shell did not hit Franz's calf. It hit the building's central support column. The entire structure, 3 stories of brick, wood, and memory, collapsed inwards and then outwards in a single, rolling avalanche of destruction. The shock wave picked Klaus up and threw him back through the rotten gate into the courtyard, burying him under a shower of debris. Silence returned, broken only by the crackle of the burning T-34 and the settling of several tons of rubble where the calf and Franz had been. In the cellar, Hans heard the twin explosions, the sharp crack of Klaus's Panzerfaust, and the earth-shattering demolition of the IS-2's reply. Then nothing. No Klaus. No Franz. Just the idling rumble of the surviving monster and the hungry sound of flames. He was utterly, completely alone. The first encounter was over. They had killed a tank, and the price had been delivered in full with apocalyptic interest. Time did not resume its normal flow. It stretched and pooled, thick and syrupy, around the epicenter of the destruction. The colossal sound of the building's death faded, not into silence, but into a new, oppressive, auditory landscape. The dominant note was the hungry, crackling roar of the burning T-34, a furnace of metal and flesh. Underneath it, lower and infinitely more patient, was the diesel grumble of the IS-2, which had not advanced, but had not retreated. It was a sentinel now, guarding the kill zone it had created. And finally, there was the slow, tectonic settling of the rubble pile that had been a calf, a whisper of shifting brick, a sigh of collapsing timber. Klaus awoke into a world of pain and absolute darkness. Something heavy and jagged pressed down on his legs. Dust filled his mouth and nose, a dry, choking paste. He tried to move, and a white-hot lance of agony shot from his ribs. A cracked or broken bone, the diagnosis was instant and clinical in his mind. The debris had not crushed him. It had buried him in a shallow, terrible grave, under the splintered remains of the courtyard gate and part of a collapsed wall. He could see nothing, but he could hear the two sounds, the fire and the tank. And he could think one name, not as a word, but as a final fading echo in the cavern of his skull. Franz. He did not call out. The veteran's lesson was etched into his nerves now. You are rats. You run. You disappear. To make a sound was to die. He lay still, listening past the immediate sounds. He heard new ones. Boots. Cautious, scraping footsteps on rubble. Guttural voices calling to each other in short, sharp bursts. The Soviet infantry was moving in, securing the carnage their metal beast had wrought. They would be checking the T-34, searching the ruins for survivors, for threats. They would be coming here. Across the street, deep in the lightless cellar, Hans had reached a state beyond terror. It was a silent, catatonic paralysis. His body had shut down, conserving energy for a flight reflex that had nowhere to go. He had heard the world end above him, felt the cellar dust shake loose from the ceiling in a continuous shower. The sounds of the enemy soldiers now, so close above the thin shell of rubble and floorboards, were not an external threat, but an internal reality. They were already inside his mind, their boots pacing on the roof of his coffin. He had wet himself. The warm spread a distant, shameful sensation against the overwhelming cold of his fear. He clutched the cold steel of his unused Panzerfaust to his chest, like a child's stuffed toy, a grotesque comfort object. He was not a soldier hiding. He was a fossil, already buried, waiting to be discovered. Klaus, in his tomb of brick, began to work. Every movement was a calculated gamble against pain and noise. He tested the weight on his legs. It was heavy, but not immovable. Using his elbows and his one good arm, he began to shift the smaller pieces, feeling his way in the dark. A brick, a shattered beam. He moved with the slowness of geological forces, pausing for minutes at a time when the voices outside seemed too close. The pain in his side was a constant, grinding companion, a metronome, counting down his dwindling strength. He thought of nothing but mechanics, leverage, distribution of weight, the angle of escape. After an eternity of minute adjustments, The pressure on his legs lessened. He could bend his knees. With a final silent push that tore a gasp from his lips, he pulled himself free. He lay in the open, still in the deep shadow of the courtyard, breathing in ragged, controlled bursts. He was a creature of dust and blood now. He looked towards the cellar entrance where he had left Hans. It was buried under a slide of debris from the cafe's collapse. No one was coming out of there, and no one could get in. Hans was sealed in his tomb, alive or dead. Klaus's survival calculus rebooted. Objectives: 1. Assess the threat. 2. Find a weapon. 3. Disappear. He army crawled to the edge of the courtyard, peering through a fissure in the wall into the main street. The scene was a tableau of modern myth. The IS-2 sat like a dragon on its hoard of ruin, its engine still rumbling, its gun barrel now smoking slightly from the recent shot. Its turret was rotated slightly, watching the burning carcass of its companion. Around the T-34, dark figures moved, Soviet infantry. They kept their distance from the intense heat. But one brave soul, a young soldier with a soot-streaked face, was trying to approach the driver's hatch, perhaps on a hopeless rescue mission. The air shimmered with heat and the stench of cooked metal and worse things. But Klaus's eyes were not on the infantry, nor on the burning tank. They were fixed on the IS-2 itself. This was his first real, sustained look at the monster that had killed Franz and his entire world. He studied it not with hatred, but with the desperate focus of a biologist studying a predator. He saw the way the sloped frontal armor deflected light, creating an illusion of invulnerability. He traced the line of the tracks, the vulnerable road wheels. He noted the lower, flatter surface of the rear engine deck, just above the exhaust grills. He saw the commander, a tiny figure in the circular hatch, surveying the destruction with a calm, almost bored authority. The tank was not a machine of war. It was a mobile, sovereign piece of terrain. To attack it was not an act of combat, but of geology, an attempt to cause a landslide with a single pickaxe. And then he saw Franz. Or rather, he saw a piece of him. Protruding from the edge of the gargantuan rubble pile was a familiar, frayed scrap of gray wool. Franz's scarf. It was not attached to anything. It lay there, dust-coated but unmistakable, a flag on a mountain of defeat. It was the only part of Franz that the war had not immediately vaporized or buried. The symbol of his faith, now just debris. A coldness settled over Klaus, deeper than the pain in his ribs, more absolute than the fear. The last flicker of the boy who calculated odds for fun, who watched his friend with pity, who believed in the logic of survival, went out. What remained was something harder, emptier, and infinitely more dangerous. He was no longer trying to survive the war. The war had already consumed him. What was left was a ghost, with a single crystalline directive. The objective in his mind simplified, sharpened to a razor point. It was no longer about biting the tiger in the heel. The tiger had taken everything. The only thing left was to make the tiger feel it. To leave a mark, a scar, a whisper of pain in its mountain of steel. He looked at the Panzerfaust tube he had discarded. It was useless, spent. He needed a new tooth. His eyes scanned the courtyard, the adjacent ruin. A weapon, a plan, a target. The Soviet infantry leader barked an order. The soldiers began to form up, preparing to move forward, using the IS-2 as their rolling fortress. The tank's engine revved, a deep-throated growl that promised more streets, more buildings, more death. It began to move forward again, grinding past the burning T-34, its tracks crushing the scattered bricks that were all that remained of Franz. Klaus watched it go, the giant's side, then its broad, vulnerable rear slowly passing his hiding place. The distance was right. The angle was perfect. And he had nothing to shoot. He was a ghost with a purpose and no means. He sank back into the shadows as the monster rumbled on, leaving only the burning wreck and the mountain of rubble in its wake. The first wave had passed. He was still alive. Hans was buried. Franz was gone. And the ghost had a name for the enemy now. It wasn't the Russians. It wasn't the IS-2. It was the specific rumbling iron mountain that had just turned the corner. He would find a way to hunt it, or he would die trying. The calculation was that simple. The IS-2's rumble receded, a slow tectonic heartbeat fading into the maze of ruins. Its departure did not bring relief, only a different kind of emptiness. The burning T-34 continued to crackle, a funeral pyre marking the center of the new, silent world. The Soviet infantry had moved on with their steel guardian, leaving behind only the ghosts and the buried. Klaus waited in the courtyard's deep shadow, a statue of dust and pain. He counted to 300, his mind a metronome, measuring the retreat of immediate danger. Only when the last echo of grinding treads had been absorbed by the city's bones did he move. The movement was no longer human. It was the deliberate, economical uncoiling of a predator wounded, but not broken. The sharp agony in his ribs was now a familiar part of his architecture, a load-bearing wall of pain he had to work around. He did not go to the rubble pile that had swallowed Franz. There was nothing to dig for, no hope to excavate. The gray scrap of scarf was a tombstone. Instead, he turned his back on it and faced the sealed cellar entrance. Hans. The thought was not emotional. It was an inventory item. One asset, possibly still functional. Location, trapped. Klaus approached the landslide of bricks and splintered beams. He placed his ear against the cool, dusty surface. He heard nothing but the distant fire. He dared not call out. Instead, he began to work, not with frantic desperation, but with the focused precision of a sapper. He was not clearing a rescue tunnel. He was testing a hypothesis. Brick by brick, he removed the loosest debris from the top of the pile, creating a narrow, vertical chimney. The work was excruciating. Each lift sent jolts through his torso, sweat mixed with grime, carving clean tracks down his face. After an hour of silent labor, his fingers, bleeding and raw, broke through into a void. A breath of stale, cold air, smelling of damp earth and fear, wafted up. He widened the hole just enough. Then he found a small, loose stone and dropped it through. He waited. A long moment of silence. Then, from the profound blackness below, a faint metallic tap. Then another. A hesitant, rhythmic scraping. A signal. Hans was alive and coherent enough to respond. Klaus felt no surge of joy, only a confirmation of data. He leaned close to the hole, his voice a dry, barely audible rasp, not a whisper, but the sound of two stones grinding together. "Can you breathe?" A pause. Then, a single sharp tap from below. "Yes." "The way out is blocked. I will clear it, but you must be silent. Absolute silence. They may come back." Two quick taps. "Understood." "Can you move? Are you hurt?" A longer pause. Then, 3 slow, uneven scrapes. Maybe. Unknown. Klaus sat back. The situation was defined. His own strength was depleting rapidly. He needed water, a weapon, and a plan. Clearing the cellar completely was a task for a team of men with tools, not for one wounded boy. Hans was a resource, but an inaccessible one. Klaus needed to adapt. He left the hole, moving away from the street, deeper into the labyrinth of interconnected ruins. This was his domain now. The city above was a graveyard for giants, but below and within, there was a secret world. He moved with a new, instinctual knowledge. He was no longer a resident hiding in his neighborhood. He was its spirit, its malevolent genius loci. He navigated not by streets, but by fractures. A kicked-in wall led from a collapsed bakery into the skeleton of a tailor's shop. A hole in the floor, masked by a fallen cabinet, dropped him into a coal cellar that connected, via a low, rat-infested tunnel, to the sub-basement of a larger apartment block. This was the Rat King's map, a three-dimensional maze of despair, forgotten by both armies. In this underworld, he began his grim harvest. In the coal cellar, he found a treasure, an untouched case of army crackers, hard as stone, and 2 cans of ersatz meat, discarded in a retreat. He devoured 2 crackers immediately, the act purely functional, forcing his jaw to work on the tasteless, plaster-like substance. Water was harder. He remembered a burst pipe they had passed days ago. He retraced his ghostly steps, finding it still dripping a slow, rusty trickle into a ceramic sink. He drank until his stomach ached, then filled a shattered bottle he found. His next objective was a weapon, a Panzerfaust. He returned to the main killing ground only once, a fleeting shadow at the edge of twilight. The T-34 was a dark, smoldering husk now, the flames reduced to embers deep within its carcass. The air still stank. He avoided it, skirting the perimeter of the rubble mountain. He was not looking for sentiment. He was looking for tools. He found one in an alley a block back from the main event. A dead Volkssturm man, an old fellow with a thin white beard, lay half-propped against a wall. He had been caught by shrapnel or a sniper. Clutched in his rigid hands was a pristine Panzerfaust 100, its larger, more potent warhead a promise of greater reach. Klaus pried it from the dead man's grip. The fingers were cold and stiff, offering a final grim resistance. Klaus felt nothing. It was a transaction. He also took the man's bread bag, slinging it over his shoulder, adding the crackers and meat to his inventory. Armed, watered, and provisioned, he returned to the cellar entrance, under cover of full darkness. The night was moonless, the only light coming from the dull red glow of the T-34's heart. He worked for another hour, silently enlarging the chimney. Finally, he judged it wide enough. He dropped the end of a length of electrical cable he had scavenged down the hole. After a moment, he felt a weak tug. He braced himself, planted his feet, and began to pull. It was an agonizing process. Hans was a dead weight, weak from terror and dehydration. Klaus's ribs screamed in protest, a white-hot fire spreading through his chest. He gritted his teeth, his vision spotting with the strain. Slowly, inch by tortuous inch, a shape emerged from the hole. Hans slithered out onto the rubble like a newborn creature, pale, blinking, covered in a fine gray powder. He stank of urine and sweat. His eyes were huge, vacant saucers in the dim red light. He saw Klaus, but there was no recognition, only a primal wariness. He was an animal pulled from a trap. Klaus didn't speak. He handed Hans the water bottle. Hans drank greedily, choking, water spilling down his chin. Klaus let him have 3 gulps, then took it back. Too much too fast would make him sick. He gave him a single cracker. Hans stared at it, uncomprehending. then began to gnaw on it mechanically. Klaus waited, watching the street. When Hans had finished the cracker, Klaus leaned close. He didn't offer comfort. He offered a new reality. "Franz is gone," Klaus said, his voice flat. "The calf is gone. The tank that did it is still out there. It will come back, or one just like it. We have one weapon." He gestured to the Panzerfaust 100. "We have two choices. We can try to run west, through the lines. The Russians are everywhere. They will shoot us, or worse, or we stay. We use the city. We become part of it. And we wait for that tank to come back down this street, or one like it. And we kill it." He let the words hang in the foul air. He was not giving a pep talk. He was presenting a military briefing to his sole remaining subordinate. He was drawing the Rat King's map for Hans, showing him the only two paths in their maze: certain death fleeing or probable death fighting, but with a sliver of purpose. Hans looked from Klaus's grim, dust-caked face to the sinister shape of the Panzerfaust, then out to the dark silhouette of the burning tank and the monstrous shadow of the rubble pile. He was broken, but in the emptiness a new, fragile wire of understanding was strung. There was no going back to being a boy carrying a bucket. There was only the maze, the weapon, and the ghost beside him. Slowly, he nodded. It was not a nod of courage, but of surrender to a new, darker truth. Klaus nodded back. The team was reassembled. The hunt was officially on. He helped Hans to his feet, and together they disappeared back into the crack in the world, leaving the street to its dead. They became creatures of the interstitial world. Days lost meaning, measured not by sun, but by the distant rhythms of the front, surges of artillery to the north, the stutter of small arms fire moving like a weather front from east to west. Their universe was the network of ruptures, the hollowed-out buildings, the choked sewers, the skeletal frameworks of apartments where floors had collapsed into a single multi-level chasm of splintered wood and dangling plaster. Klaus was the architect of their survival. He treated their existence as a complex engineering problem with a single, horrific, desired outcome. His mind, once used for schoolbook equations, now calculated vectors of fire, blast radii, and the metabolic cost of every movement. He mapped the territory around the kill zone with the devotion of a cartographer. He knew which floorboards would scream underfoot, which walls were mere shells of brick, which vantage points offered a clear 30-meter lane of fire into the street below. Hans was his shadow, a silent, trembling apprentice to this new, deadly science. The catatonia had receded, replaced by a hollowed-out obedience. He followed Klaus's precise hand signals without question. He learned to move with a predator's silence, placing his feet with exaggerated care. He learned to listen, to differentiate between the harmless scuttle of rats and the deliberate booted step of a patrol, between the idle rumble of a distant truck and the specific, gut-deep vibration of heavy armor. He was being remade, not into a soldier, but into a component of Klaus's machine. Their target was not a generic enemy. It was singular. It was the IS-2, the one with the fresh scar on its left flank from Franz's futile shot, the one that had idled by the burning T-34. Klaus had imprinted its specific auditory signature into his soul. A slight, metallic ping in its right track, a deeper cough in its exhaust than the others they sometimes heard. He was not planning to ambush any tank. He was planning a revenge killing. The plan, when Klaus finally unveiled it in the darkness of their current lair, a dry section of sewer pipe, was a thing of chilling, elegant brutality. He explained it, using scratched diagrams in the dirt. The main street was a death funnel. The IS-2 dominated it. To attack it, there was suicide. But the IS-2 did not operate alone. It had a weakness: its need for reconnaissance, for infantry support, for clearing side alleys. It would often send its accompanying T-34s or squads of submachine gunners down the narrower parallel streets, like fingers feeling ahead of a fist. Klaus had identified one such alley, barely 3 meters wide, 1 block over from the main thoroughfare. It was a perfect kill box. A building had collapsed at its far end, creating a natural cul-de-sac. The only way out was back the way you came. "We don't bait the big one," Klaus whispered, his voice a dry rasp in the conduit. "We bait the little ones. We make noise. A shot, a shout, something to draw a probe. They will send a squad or a light vehicle to clear the alley. We let them come all the way in. We trap them at the dead end." Hans stared, uncomprehending. The goal was the IS-2. Why waste their only weapon on a squad of infantry? Klaus's finger moved in the dirt. "We don't shoot them with the Panzerfaust. We use rifles." He had recovered 2 Kar 98K rifles from the dead in the ruins. "We pin them down. We make them scream for help. A trapped squad, under fire from an unseen enemy. That," he said, his eyes glinting in the faint light, "is bait the big fish cannot ignore. The IS-2 will come. It has to support its men, to blast the building we are in. It will position itself here." His finger stabbed a point at the alley's entrance on the main street. "Its side will be exposed to us from a new position we will take after we start the fight. We hit it there, in the flank, at 20 meters. It was a plan of diabolical complexity, requiring split-second timing, perfect execution, and a total disregard for the lives they would use as chum. Hans felt a cold nausea rise in his throat. It was one thing to shoot at a steel monster. It was another to lure men into a trap to be slaughtered, just to draw out a bigger beast. He looked at Klaus, but saw no cruelty, only the pure, chilling logic of the calculus. This was the math of vengeance, and it was absolute. The preparation took a full day and night. They positioned the rifles at a second-story window overlooking the dead end of the alley, rigging a rope to pull the triggers from a hidden position deeper in the ruin. A crude, but effective, remote ambush. They stockpiled a few precious grenades found on a dead sergeant. They prepared their escape route through a pre-cleared path of collapsing interiors that led away from the kill zone. Finally, they prepared the firing position for the Panzerfaust. Klaus chose not the building facing the alley's entrance, but one set back, at a diagonal, with a clear line of sight through a shell hole in 2 intervening walls. It was a tunnel of destruction, perfectly aligned. They camouflaged the hole with a torn piece of carpet and rubble. They would have one shot, less than 2 seconds from the backblast to their escape. Dawn of the execution day arrived, gray and damp. They took their positions. Hans was at the remote trigger for the rifles, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. Klaus was beside the Panzerfaust, his eye a permanent fixture at the narrow viewing slit. His body coiled. The wait was an eternity of amplified sounds, their own breathing, the drip of water, the distant war. Then, as if on cue, they heard it. The familiar hated rumble. Their IS-2. It was moving on the main street, parallel to their alley. They heard the chatter of accompanying infantry. Klaus nodded. Hans pulled the rope. The 2 rifles fired almost as one, a shocking, violent noise in the confined space of the alley. From their hidden vantage, they saw the Soviet squad, 5 men, jerk and dive for cover as bullets sparked off the cobblestones around them. One man cried out, clutching his leg. The squad was pinned, trapped against the rubble heap at the alley's end. Their leader shouted into his radio, his voice a distorted, panicked crackle. The reaction was swift. The IS-2's engine roared. They heard its tracks screech as it pivoted on the main street. Just as Klaus predicted, it maneuvered to block the alley's entrance, its massive bulk filling the narrow opening, its side armor presenting a perfect, broad target to Klaus's firing lane. The commander's head was visible, scanning the upper windows of the building where the rifle shots had originated. This was it. The moment. The calculus had worked. Klaus took a final, steadying breath. He flipped up the sight. He centered the aiming prong on the center of the IS-2's hull, just behind the turret. The range was perfect. 25 meters. He began to squeeze the trigger. And then, the variable. A small door in the building opposite the IS-2, a basement entrance they had missed, burst open. 2 Soviet soldiers, having looped around another block, emerged directly into the alley, behind the tank but facing Klaus's position. They saw the camouflaged hole. They saw the unmistakable shape of the Panzerfaust barrel. One of them screamed a warning, raising his submachine gun. Time fractured. Klaus had a choice: fire and achieve his vengeance, but be cut down in the ensuing hail of bullets before he could escape or abort. His mind, the supreme calculator, processed the new data in a microsecond. Vengeance was a luxury. Survival was the prime directive. The machine overrode the ghost. He abandoned the shot. He threw himself backwards, shoving Hans away from the viewing slit. "Run!" The next second was a storm of noise and light. The Soviet soldiers' PPSH emptied an entire drum magazine into their position. Bullets tore through the thin wall, chewing up the space where Klaus's head had been a moment before. Plaster and wood exploded. From the alley, the trapped squad, seeing the distraction, began laying down, suppressing fire. Their pre-planned escape route was now a deadly gauntlet. They scrambled, crawled, fell through the labyrinth as bullets snapped and whined around them, chasing them through holes in walls, kicking up dust at their heels. A grenade rolled into a room they had just vacated, its blast hurling them forward with concussive force. They tumbled finally into the relative safety of their original sewer pipe, bruised, bleeding from a dozen cuts, lungs burning. They lay in the pitch dark, listening to the furious response unfold. The IS-2, now fully alerted, unleashed its wrath. The 122mm gun fired once, twice into the building that had housed their firing position. The sound of collapsing masonry was a final, definitive period to their plan. Silence descended again, heavier than before. They had failed. The bait was taken, the trap was sprung, the shot was lined up, and they had run. The IS-2 lived, the ghost had been outmaneuvered. In the absolute darkness, Hans began to cry, silent, heaving sobs of exhaustion, terror, and defeat. Klaus did not move. He lay on the cold, damp concrete, staring into nothing. The perfect calculus had been flawed by a single, unseen door. The machine had functioned, but the world was not a machine. It was chaos. And in chaos, monsters thrived. He had never felt closer to Franz, or farther from his goal. The failure was not an event. It was an environment. It seeped into the stone around them, into the air they breathed, into the marrow of their bones. The sewer pipe was no longer a hideout. It was a sarcophagus for their last shred of purpose. Hans's silent weeping had subsided into a shallow, tremulous breathing, the sound of a small animal dying of shock. Klaus lay motionless, his mind not racing, but empty. The elegant architecture of his plan lay in ruins, more thoroughly demolished than the building the IS-2 had shelled. He had accounted for the tank, for the infantry, for ballistics, and escape routes. He had not accounted for a random door. The lesson was absolute. In this world, chaos was the only constant, and chaos favored the giants. For hours, they did not move. The distant sounds of the front lines seemed to mock them, receding westward, leaving them behind in a stagnant backwater of the war. They were not soldiers in a retreat. They were ghosts, haunting a corpse. It was hunger that finally forced Klaus to move, a dull, animal ache that pierced the veil of his stupor. Their meager supplies were gone, lost in the frantic escape. He rolled onto his side, the pain in his ribs a familiar worn companion now. He looked at Hans. The boy's eyes were open, glassy, fixed on the curved ceiling of the pipe as if watching a movie of his own unraveling. He was broken beyond the reach of any plan. Klaus knew then that the hunt was over. The ghost's purpose had evaporated. What remained was a simpler, more brutal imperative. Survival, not as a mission, but as a biological fact. They needed food, water, and a way out of the tomb their city had become. The idea of facing the IS-2 again was not just futile, it was absurd. It was a mountain, and they were insects. You do not wage war on a mountain. You flee its shadow. He nudged Hans. No response. He shook him, harder. Hans's head lolled towards him, the eyes slowly focusing, but with no recognition, only a deep, vacant weariness. "We're leaving," Klaus said, his voice raw. "We're going west. Tonight." Hans blinked slowly. Leaving the maze was a concept his shattered mind could not immediately process. The maze was all there was. Klaus spent the remaining daylight hours on a final, grim reconnaissance. He moved like a phantom through the familiar cracks and crevices, but his objective was new. He was mapping an exodus. He needed a route that avoided the main arteries, where Soviet patrols and armor would be thickest. He needed to cross the river, the final geographical barrier before the shattered suburbs gave way to open country. The bridges would be blown or heavily guarded. That left the underground, the main sewer trunk line, a brick-vaulted channel of filth and darkness that ran directly under the river. Returning to the pipe as full darkness fell, he found Hans sitting up, holding the last cracker from a forgotten pocket, staring at it. Klaus described the plan in blunt, simple terms. The trunk line. Follow the current. Exit on the western bank. Find German lines or melt into the countryside. He made it sound like a logistics exercise, stripping it of all hope to make it palatable to Hans's broken state. Hans just nodded, a slow, mechanical dip of the chin. Their final passage through their ruined kingdom was a farewell tour devoid of sentiment. They passed the blackened skeleton of the T-34, now cold and silent. They skirted the vast, moonlit mound that had been the calf. Klaus did not look for the scarf. It was gone, buried under tons of indifference. They were not leaving a home. They were evacuating a graveyard. The entrance to the main sewer was a yawning, foul-breathed maw in the riverbank, partially collapsed, streaming with viscous water. The smell was a physical force, a thick, gagging miasma of human waste, chemical runoff, and decay. It was the smell of the city's dying bowels. They stood at the threshold, the relative purity of the ruined world at their backs, the absolute foulness ahead. Klaus lit their last precious resource, a makeshift torch of rag and wood soaked in stolen engine oil. The flame sputtered, casting a hellish dancing light on the slime-coated brick walls. The tunnel was a cathedral of filth, vaulted and echoing with the drip and gurgle of flowing effluent. The central channel was a river of black, moving sludge. Without a word, they waded in. The shock was not the cold, but the texture. A thick, cloying suction that pulled at their boots, the feel of unspeakable things brushing against their legs. They moved against a gentle current, the torchlight throwing their gigantic, wavering shadows against the arching walls, turning them into caricatures of themselves. The only sounds were their sloshing steps, their labored breathing, and the distant, echoing drip from ceilings they could not see. They had been moving for what felt like an hour, the tunnel featureless and endless, when the world above them remembered they existed. It began as a deep, shuddering thump, felt through the water and the brick. Then another. Artillery. A massive barrage. Soviet Katyushas, or heavy guns, finding a target zone on the western bank. With each impact, the ancient sewer trembled. Dust and chips of mortar rained down from the ceiling. The water in the channel rippled violently. Then, a direct hit, somewhere above and ahead of them. The concussion was a physical fist in the confined space. A section of the vaulted ceiling stressed by weeks of bombings, and now this final hammer blow, gave way. It was not an explosion of water, but of masonry and earth. A torrent of rubble, mud, and filth crashed down into the channel 30 meters ahead of them, followed by a deluge of water from a shattered main. The wall of debris completely blocked the tunnel. But worse than the blockage was the water. With its main channel dammed, the backed-up effluent began to rise. Fast. The torchlight revealed the truth in a horrifying rising line on the wall. The black, putrid tide swelled from their ankles to their knees in seconds. Their path forward was sealed by a mountain of rubble and rushing water. Panic, pure and undiluted, broke through Hans's catatonia. He screamed, a high, ragged sound swallowed by the tunnel. He thrashed, trying to climb the slick, curved walls, sliding back into the rising filth. Klaus's mind, the cool calculator, saw the equation instantly. They could not go forward. They could not stay. The water would rise to the ceiling in minutes, drowning them in sewage. There was only one direction. Back. Towards the city. Towards the ruins. Towards the IS-2. "The way we came!" Klaus roared, the first true emotion in his voice in days. Raw, animal survival fear. He grabbed Hans by his sodden coat, spinning him around. The torch guttered in the disturbed air. They began to slog, then stumble, then fight their way back through the channel, now a waist-deep, swiftly flowing torrent, as the pressure built behind them. It was a flight through a nightmare. The rising water fought them, carrying debris that slammed into their legs. The torch died, plunging them into absolute, suffocating blackness. They were blind. The only senses left were touch, the horrific, sliding pressure of the sewage around them, and sound, the terrible growing roar of the water chasing them, and the relentless, mocking thump of the artillery above, sealing their fate. They crashed into walls, fell, swallowed mouthfuls of the putrid tide, gagging and screaming. Klaus's hand found a rusted ladder rung set into the wall, the access shaft they had entered by. He hauled Hans towards it, shoving him up first. Hans scrambled up the iron rungs, slipping in the slime. Klaus followed as the water swirled at his heels, then his waist, trying to pull him back into the dark. They erupted into the night air at the riverbank, collapsing onto the mud, vomiting and gasping. They were coated head to toe in a reeking black carapace. Behind them, from the sewer mouth, came the gushing roar of the pent-up filth, finally bursting through a weaker point, a vile geyser marking the tomb of their escape. The artillery barrage tapered off. An unnatural silence fell, broken only by their retching and the distant crackle of fires. They lay on the bank, under the cold stars, utterly defeated. The maze had rejected their exit. The city would not let them go. They had been vomited back into its ruins, baptized in its waste. Klaus rolled onto his back, the cold mud a bitter relief. He looked up at the sky. The calculus was gone. The machine was broken. All that was left was the ashes of a purpose and a single, undeniable truth. They had nowhere to run. The hunt was not a choice. It was their only remaining geography. They would have to find the monster again. And this time, they would have to face it in the open, with nothing left to lose. The covenant was sealed not in blood, but in filth and failure. They did not rise from the riverbank as soldiers, or even as hunters. They crawled. They were creatures of mud and excretion, their forms indistinguishable from the refuse of the city. The cold night air crystallized the filth on their skin and clothes into a stiff, cracking shell. They shivered, not from the chill, but from a deep, systemic shock that had moved past their nerves into their very bones. There was no plan to formulate, no strategy to whisper in the dark. The arithmetic of survival had been reduced to its most primal terms. Move, or freeze to death. Find shelter, or be spotted and shot as monstrous apparitions. They hauled themselves up the slick bank and into the familiar, welcoming scar tissue of the ruins. The maze, which had rejected their escape, now embraced their return with a grim, possessive finality. It was all they had left. They found a cavity, a collapsed cellar with a pocket of air under a fallen beam, and huddled there, not for strategy, but for animal warmth. The smell of themselves was unbearable, a constant reminder of their failed exodus. As the first gray light of dawn seeped into their hole, Klaus moved first. With stiff, robotic motions, he used his knife to scrape the worst of the filth from his hands and face. He did the same for Hans, who sat compliant as a doll. The action was not about cleanliness. It was about restoring minimal function to their bodies, the last maintenance on 2 broken tools. Silently, they scouted their immediate vicinity. The world had changed once more. The artillery barrage that had trapped them in the sewer had been a prelude. The Soviet advance had solidified, moved past them. The sounds of combat were now firmly to the west, a distant thunder. Their sector was a dead zone, a cleared pocket between waves. It was eerily quiet, occupied only by the dead and the remnants. In this silence, they found their tools, not by design, but by the cold logic of a picked-over battlefield. In the rubble of a smashed anti-tank gun position, Klaus found a single forgotten Panzerfaust 60. It was older, less powerful than the 100, its range shorter. It was a last resort someone had left behind. He picked it up. Its weight was no longer a promise but a sentence. Nearby, Hans stood staring at a crater. At its edge lay a dead Soviet soldier, a scout, killed by a stray shell or a sniper days before. In his stiffened hand was not a rifle, but a RP-46I, a Soviet light machine gun, its pan magazine still half full, a weapon of suppression, of area denial. Hans looked from it to Klaus. No words were needed. The calculus, in its final brutal form, was presenting itself. One weapon to wound the beast. One weapon to keep its infantry at bay. They took them. The transaction was complete. They were now armed not for a clever ambush, but for a last stand. The ghost and the hollow boy had been issued their final roles. Klaus led them not to another clever vantage point, but back to the beginning. To the one place in the maze that held any meaning, however terrible. They emerged onto the main street, the site of the first catastrophe. The burnt-out hulk of the T-34 was a familiar landmark. The mountain of rubble that was Franz's tomb had settled slightly, and there in the middle of the street lay the faded gray scrap of wool, Franz's scarf, finally freed from the debris by the night's rains, resting on the cobbles like a shedskin. Klaus walked to it. He did not pick it up. He looked at it, then past it, down the long east-west axis of the street. This was the path the IS-2 would take when it returned, as the rear guard, as the cleanup crew, as the final rolling verdict on this sector. It would come from the east. It would roll past the dead T-34. It would pass this spot. He made his decision. There would be no more alleys, no more tunnels, no more bait. There was only the street. A direct, perpendicular line of fire. A geometry of finality. He positioned Hans first. He put him in the ground floor cavity of a building directly across from the rubble mountain, 15 meters from the street. He gave him the Soviet machine gun. His instructions were simple, repeated until they etched themselves into Hans's vacant eyes. When the infantry comes, when they are close, you fire. You don't stop until the belt is empty. You don't look for me. You just fire. Hans nodded, his fingers curling around the foreign weapon, his knuckles white. He would obey. It was the last thread of his consciousness. Klaus then chose his own position. Not hidden, not camouflaged. He walked to the very center of the street, a few meters in front of the scrap of scarf. He faced east, from where the monster would come. To his left was the burnt T-34. To his right, the rubble mound. He was placing himself in the middle of his own cemetery. He did not take cover. He sat down on the cold, damp cobblestones, his back against a chunk of broken curbstone. He placed the Panzerfaust across his lap. He would not brace it in a window. He would fire it from his lap like a medieval knight couching a lance for a final, suicidal joust. The range would be point blank. 10 meters, maybe less. The backblast would scour the street behind him. He would likely be burned. He did not factor in escape. There was no after in this equation. And then they waited. The sun climbed, pale and weak, doing nothing to warm them. The distant thunder in the west rumbled on. Time became a single, stretched moment of anticipation. They were not hiding. They were presenting themselves. A sacrifice and a chalice of fury arranged on the altar of the street. The signal came not as sound first, but as the familiar faint tremor in the ground. Then the grinding clatter of one set of tracks, not a group. A solitary hunter, mopping up. Then the diesel growl, growing louder, deeper, more specific. It was their sound. The familiar ping in the track. The specific cough. Klaus's heart did not race. A profound, icy calm settled over him. He watched the eastern end of the street. The monstrous shadow appeared first, stretching long and dark up the cobblestones. Then the iron itself nosed into view. The IS-2. It was slower now, confident. Its long gun was traversed slightly to the side, its hatches open. The commander was visible up to his chest, surveying his domain through binoculars. It crunched over debris, past the burnt-out skeleton of its old companion without a pause. Klaus made no move to raise his weapon. He waited. He was a stone, a part of the ruin. The tank closed the distance. 100 meters, 70, 50. It had not seen him, a still, filthy figure against the gray stone. At 30 meters, the commander's binoculars swept over him, paused, and swept back. The figure registered. Not a corpse. Corpses didn't sit upright. A threat. The turret began to rotate, not with urgency, but with a slow, inquisitive menace. The barrel started to depress. This was the moment. Klaus moved. In one smooth, deliberate motion, he stood up. He did not run. He did not crouch. He stood to his full height in the middle of the street, facing the oncoming mountain of steel. He brought the Panzerfaust up to his shoulder, the motion practiced, final. The tank's machine gun erupted first. A hail of bullets screamed past him, sparked off the cobbles at his feet, stitched a line towards him. Chips of stone stung his legs. He ignored them. He was already aiming, not at the frontal glacis, not at the turret. He aimed at the lower hull, right at the seam where the first road wheel met the track. A joint. A point of articulation. He was waiting for the tank to do one thing, to instinctively turn its strongest armor towards the threat, to present its frontal arc. The commander, seeing the distinct, stupid shape of the Panzerfaust, shouted. The driver reacted. The IS-2's left track locked, the right churned. The massive beast began a slow, pivoting turn to face him head-on, to bring its impervious bow to bear. In that turn, for a span of 2 seconds, its side hull, the flank Klaus had studied, the flank he had missed, presented itself. Not a full broadside, but a diagonal slice. It was enough. Klaus fired. The rocket left the tube with its familiar fiery shriek. The backblast was a furnace at his back, searing his coat, but he held his ground. The shaped charge flew its pitifully short, absolutely final trajectory. It struck the IS-2 exactly where he had aimed, on the turning hull, just above the fourth road wheel. The impact was not a fuel tank explosion. It was a deep, internal crunch, a catastrophic rupture of steel and mechanics. A jet of white-hot metal pierced the armor, spearing into the engine compartment, slicing into fuel lines, perhaps into ammunition. A secondary, violent fireball erupted from within the hull, billowing out from the shattered track guards and hatches. The IS-2 shuddered, its engine dying with a final agonized shriek of tearing metal. It slewed sideways, its turn track now a dead weight, and came to a lopsided halt. Black, oily smoke pouring from its wound. It was not a dead monster, but a crippled one, bleeding out internally. Klaus dropped the spent tube. He did not run. He stood, smoke curling from his scorched back, and watched his work. From the building across the street, the Soviet infantry that had been trailing the tank, now exposed and leaderless, began to shout and advance. And from the cavity in the ruins, Hans, triggered by the closeness, by the sound, by his last order, opened fire. The Soviet machine gun in his hands came to life with a deafening, ripping roar. He held the trigger down, the half-pan of ammunition expending itself in one long, continuous, vengeful scream of lead. He hosed the street, not aiming, just pouring fire towards the advancing shapes, pinning them down, cutting them down in a wild, chaotic arc. It was the voice of all their terror, all their loss, given form in a storm of bullets. Klaus watched as the Soviet soldiers dove for cover behind the crippled tank, behind the rubble. He saw the tank commander, wounded, trying to haul himself from his hatch. He saw the black smoke thickening. He had done it. He had wounded the mountain. A shot rang out, different from the machine gun's rage. A sniper, or a careful infantryman. Klaus felt the impact in his leg before he heard the sound. A hard, numbing blow that spun him to the ground. He fell near the scrap of gray scarf. He lay on his side, looking at it. The machine gun fire stopped abruptly. Hans's belt was empty. In the sudden ringing silence, new shouts filled the air. Orders. Boots running. Klaus's vision began to tunnel. He saw Boots approaching, cautious, from the direction of the tank. Green-gray wool. The muzzles of rifles pointed at him. He did not look at them. His eyes were fixed on the scrap of gray wool, inches from his face. He had kept his covenant. He had made the tiger feel it. The last thing he saw was not the enemy soldiers, nor the burning, hulking monument to his vengeance. It was the frayed threads of the scarf, each one a perfect, intricate geometry against the infinite gray of the cobblestone. And then a shadow fell across it, blotting out the weak sun.